In the early spring of 1831, her holy Daw, the wife of Chief Four Horns of the Hunkpapa Sioux, gave birth to a baby boy, who was given the child name of Jumping Badger. Jumping Badger's childhood followed the ancient Sioux pattern, by which young boys learned the many facets of Sioux life from fathers and uncles and old men well versed in the ancient Sioux traditions. But above all, a pride in being a Sioux was instilled into the boys, and their sole ambition was to become a successful warrior. War was the breath of life to the Sioux, and as warriors they were second to none, and have been acclaimed as the finest cavalry in the world. There were three ways in which honor could be gained in battle: to kill an enemy and take his scalp, to steal horses, and to count coup, which meant striking an armed and fighting enemy with a whip or special stick called a coup stick. This was generally considered to be the highest war honor that could be gained. At the age of 14, Jumping Badger had joined his first war party, and was the first to count coup in a fight with Crow Indians. It was a great honor, and when they returned to camp, Four Horns led his son around the camp circle, proudly proclaiming his son's achievement, and declaring that from now on, Jumping Badger was to be known by the name of Tatanka Yotanki. Tatanka Yotanki means Sitting Bull, and this is how Jumping Badger wrote his new name. And this is how he drew this first war exploit in the pictographic style the Sioux used to record various events. It was the first of many such pictographs. This was Sitting Bull's next war honor, and shows him unhorsing a Crow warrior with his lance. There were many other war honors earned in combat with Crow Indians and other enemy tribes. The most famous of these was when Sitting Bull, in a fight with a Crow chief, is shot in the foot. Sitting Bull killed the Crow chief by shooting him in the stomach, but the wound in Sitting Bull's foot took some time to heal, and even then it left him with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life. Many of Sitting Bull's war honors were concerned with stealing horses, a dangerous task and one held in high esteem by the Sioux. Sitting Bull is known to have taken horses from Indian enemies on at least 20 occasions, sometimes returning home with as many as 30 horses. Indians were not the only ones to lose horses to Sitting Bull. This was his first attempt at stealing horses from whites. In a skirmish with a military wagon train, Sitting Bull makes off with a slow pack mule, and at the same time counts coup on a soldier. In 1863, Sitting Bull in a fight near Fort Totten kills his first white man, a Pony Express rider. There were to be other fights with the whites in which Sitting Bull could claim war honors. By the 1860s, Sitting Bull had become one of the most distinguished chiefs of the Sioux. No one knows the exact number of war honors he gained in his lifetime, but it is known that in 1870, 6 years before the Custer fight, Sitting Bull could claim 63 war honors. But times were changing for the Sioux. The solitary explorers, the fur trappers, and the traders that had been their first contact with the white race and whom they had made welcome were now replaced by hordes of immigrants on their way to the gold fields of Montana and California. Railroads were beginning to span the plains, and with the railroad came the settlements and the soldiers to protect them. With the opening up of the western plains in this way, the buffalo, lifeblood of all the Plains Indians, moved away from its old haunts and became difficult to hunt. All these events angered the Sioux, and there were many skirmishes between the two races. Sitting Bull took part in many fights with the whites, and on 2 separate occasions personally led large-scale attacks on military forts. By the year 1866, Red Cloud was leading his Oglala Sioux together with the Minneconjou Sioux and the Northern Cheyennes in an open war with the soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny. Sitting Bull believed Red Cloud's policy was not drastic enough and remained to the north with his Hunkpapas on their hunting grounds around the Missouri and Powder Rivers. Because of their continuing hostility, General Sheridan decided that he could best control the Sioux by establishing a military post in the Black Hills of Dakota. This was contrary to the Fort Laramie Treaty, which declared that no white man could enter Indians' lands without the permission of the Indians. In fact, it had gone one step further and pledged the government of the United States to protect the Indians against such intrusions. On July the 1st, 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led an exploratory expedition into the Black Hills. The reports Custer sent back, written in glowing terms, mentioned the discovery of gold in plenty and resulted in a gold rush. A commission was sent out from Washington to try and induce the Sioux to sell the Black Hills. The Sioux split into 2 factions over this. Those in favor of selling the hills sent Spotted Tail and other chiefs to find out the value of the Black Hills to the whites. In this task, Spotted Tail was exceptionally businesslike, but the price he insisted upon was much too high for the government. The commission had failed, and with its failure the army released its restrictions on entry into the Black Hills, and the gold seekers rushed in. Sitting Bull, with Crazy Horse, American Horse, Gull, and Black Moon, remained out on their buffalo ranges. Their attitude to the sale of the Black Hills was expressed by Sitting Bull, who said that the Black Hills belonged to them, and if the whites tried to take them, the Sioux would fight. On December the 6th, 1875, an order was sent from Washington to the Sioux agencies that all Sioux had to be in at the agencies on or before January the 31st. If not, the army would drive them in. The agencies received the order just before Christmas, and runners were sent out straight away in one of the severest Dakota winters to find the various camps. These camps had now been swelled by many friendly agency Sioux, who would come to visit friends and to hunt. They would now have little choice other than to join the hostiles, because by the time the runners reached the camps, it was quite impossible to return to the agencies by the appointed time. The time limit up, on February the 1st, the matter was handed over to the Secretary of War, General Sheridan, who ordered Generals Crook and Terry to move against the hostiles with the strongest military units ever sent out against the Sioux. In the second week of June, the annual Sundance, greatest of all Indian ceremonies, was held. Its main feature was the self-torture of the leading dancers. Sitting Bull was to be one of those dancers. Sitting Bull, who already bore the scars of previous Sundances, chose to offer 100 pieces of his flesh. With 50 tiny pieces of flesh cut off of each arm, Sitting Bull danced, gazing at the sun until he fainted. He then had a vision in which a voice said, "I give you these because they have no ears," and he saw soldiers and a few Indians falling into his camp upside down with their hats falling off. He knew what this meant. Those whites who would not listen, who made war without cause, would be coming to his camp and would be killed. Some days after the Sundance, scouts galloped into camp to report that the nearby valley of the Rosebud was black with soldiers. A council was held, and almost 1,000 warriors set off at night to meet the soldiers. At dawn, the Sioux engaged General Crook and his command of over 1,300 men. The encounter was fierce, and the Sioux soon had the upper hand. Above the war cries and gunshots could be heard the voice of Sitting Bull encouraging his warriors. Because of his Sundance wounds, he was too weak to fight, but he had still rode out with the war party. The battle lasted all day, and by nightfall the victorious Sioux could see that General Crook would now be unable to attack their village. Having achieved their aim, they called off the fight, and suddenly disappeared. For General Crook, there was nothing left to do but retreat back to his base camp. After the Battle of the Rosebud, the great camp moved to a new location, where there was fresh grass for the horses and better hunting for the men. They moved to the Valley of the Greasy Grass, as they called it, but the whites knew it by another name, the Little Bighorn. Here the great camp stretched for 3.5 miles and contained about 1,500 warriors, together with their women and children. Here were Oglala Sioux under Crazy Horse, Low Dog, Big Road, and Sweat. Minneconjou Sioux, led by Makesroom, Hump, Lame Deer, Flying By, Black Shield, and Black Moon. Hunkpapa Sioux under Gall, Crow King, Four Horns, Black Moon. Sans Arc Sioux, led by Spotted Eagle, Two Eagles, and his High Horse. There were groups from the Yanktonai Sioux, the Blackfoot Sioux, and the Two Kettle Sioux, and the Brule Sioux. Even the Santee Sioux were present, being represented by Inkpaduta's renegades. Also present were a handful of Arapahoes, and a camp of the allies of the Sioux, the Northern Cheyennes, who were led by Ice, Little Horse, and Two Moons. It was one of the largest camps ever held in Sioux lands, and Sitting Bull was its recognized leader. The days were warm and pleasant. Life in the camp went on as usual, in spite of the fact that the Sioux knew the troops were out looking for them and could not be too far away. Their camp was so enormous that they couldn't see anyone having the stupidity to attack it. They had whipped the soldiers at the Rosebud. There was Sitting Bull's vision of another victory. They felt good. June the 25th, 1876, was hot and windless. Life in the great camp went on as usual. In the Hunkpapa Council teepee, Sitting Bull, with Crow King, Black Moon, and Rain in the Face, were trying to persuade the Blackfoot Sioux chief Kill Eagle not to leave the camp with his people. Rain in the Face had just escaped from imprisonment at Fort Abraham Lincoln, and told of the far from friendly attitude of the whites. There was much talk, but eventually Kill Eagle was convinced that it was best to stay. Suddenly Brownback rushed into the tepee to tell that 2 Hunkpapa boys had been shot at by soldiers. The chief sprang up and left the tepee. Outside was pandemonium. A warrior pointed to a cloud of dust approaching the camp. As the cloud grew nearer, the blue shirts of soldiers could be seen. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors quickly gathered their weapons and horses and rode out to meet the soldiers. They met head-on, and the fighting that followed was fierce. Suddenly the soldiers dismounted and began to fight on foot. This action puzzled Sitting Bull, who dropped back to the rear of the warriors, yelling out to them to be careful, as it looked as if the soldiers were planning to trick them. The Indians kept up their fierce attack, and soon the soldiers were forced to retreat into some nearby timber. Here Major Reno, who was in command of this detachment of the 7th Cavalry, ordered his men to remount and retreat across the river. There was a lull in the fighting, and Sitting Bull galloped back to the deserted camp to find the women and children. Suddenly he came across a Negro scout that he knew. The scout lay dying and surrounded by angry warriors. Sitting Bull dismounted and gave him a drink of water, and then rode on through the camp to the high land outside, where the women and children had gathered. Here Sitting Bull ordered the warriors to stay and mount guard over these women and children. From this position, Sitting Bull could see across the river another body of soldiers riding towards the camp. Sitting Bull had all along suspected that there were more soldiers about, and now he was proved right. This was General Custer and his troops. As Custer began to cross the river, he was met by hordes of Sioux and Cheyennes. The soldiers retreated, but they were soon surrounded. The fight did not last long. With all of Custer's soldiers dead, the people began to return to the camp, and Sitting Bull and the warriors who had guarded the women and children rode off to join the warriors still fighting Major Reno and his men. When night came, there was much noise in the camp. Relatives were loudly mourning their dead, women were preparing to move camp next day. A few agency Sioux had got drunk on some whiskey they had found and were firing their guns in the air. Sitting Bull was disappointed with the Sioux. They had ignored the warning he had given them at the Sundance. Although none of his followers had touched the soldiers' equipment, the rest of the Sioux and Cheyennes had done as much looting as possible. He now warned them that because they had taken the white man's goods, they would always want them, and they would now be at the white man's mercy. At dawn, Sitting Bull rode out to join the Sioux fighting Reno. All night Reno and his men had been subject to the fire of Sioux snipers, and now in the morning they could see the Indians massing against them again. The Sioux kept charging all morning, but the soldiers were now too deeply entrenched and could not be routed. At noon, Sitting Bull told the warriors to stop fighting. Shortly after, the great camp moved out of the valley of the Little Bighorn. Major Reno counted his losses at over 50 dead and 52 wounded. The Sioux and Cheyennes had lost 32 dead. But across where Custer had made his last stand, the only living thing left was the horse Comanche. Badly wounded, but still standing, the horse was surrounded by over 200 bodies of Custer's command. These bodies had been stripped and mutilated, but not for any barbaric reason, for it was a superstition amongst the Sioux that if they did not cut up the bodies of dead warriors, these warriors would return from the dead to haunt them. From now on, the great camp was to slowly break up. First to go were the agency Sioux, and then Crazy Horse and his followers decided to return to their own territory to hunt buffalo. Sitting Bull moved across to the Yellowstone, where he not only hunted buffalo, but had several skirmishes with troops who were looking for him. There was no peace in the United States now for Sitting Bull. 11 months after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull and his followers crossed over into the land of the grandmother, Canada, where they were to stay for 4 years. Throughout that time, he was constantly visited by scouts, agency Indians, and priests, all of whom tried to get him to surrender, but he would not. He told a delegation headed by none other than General Terry that he had no intentions of returning to the United States. He liked Canada, he liked the Mounties, he intended to stay. Nothing could budge him. Commissioner McLeod of the Northwest Mounted Police had to tell him that the Canadians could not recognize his claim to be a British Indian. They would not give him rations, but if he wished to stay under the protection of the Queen, he and his followers must behave and not cross back into the United States with any hostile intentions. Sitting Bull agreed, and he kept his people in line. The constant persuasion to return to the States, though, gradually began to have an effect on Sitting Bull's camp, and small groups began to move back to the United States. Finally, Gall decided to surrender, and with him went the majority of Sitting Bull's camp. Sitting Bull was left with a small camp of followers now. Food became scarce, the Mounties would not give them any rations or grant him the reservation he constantly asked for. Reluctantly, he at last decided to surrender. On July the 19th, 1881, a dejected, hungry, and poorly clothed Sitting Bull, with 40 lodges of followers of 187 men, women, and children, came to Fort Buford to surrender. Sitting Bull was made a prisoner of war and sent to Fort Randall, where he led a quiet life, being allowed to attend to his little camp as he wished. Here, despite his reputation of being a deadly enemy of the whites, the officers of the fort were surprised by his friendliness and quiet nature. 2 years later, he was released from Fort Randall and sent to the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. Here the Indian agent, Major McLaughlin, had a field plowed and told Sitting Bull and his followers that they were to farm this land. After an awkward start, Sitting Bull in 2 days had his plot tidily planted. Even McLaughlin, Sitting Bull's severest critic, had to admit this. McLaughlin now believed that he would have little trouble with Sitting Bull, but was soon brought to the realization that the chief still had as much influence as ever. He tried to break this power by making Gall and John Grass the chiefs of Standing Rock, but even they would not go against the word of Sitting Bull, who always spoke out quite bluntly against the injustices to his people. He was a constant thorn in McLaughlin's side, the more so because he was still the most important Indian at Standing Rock. Sitting Bull was sent to attend the opening of the Northern Pacific Railroad at Bismarck, where he carried the Stars and Stripes at the head of the procession and sold his autograph, which he had learned to write from a trader in Canada, from the tailboard of a wagon. In 1884, he toured 15 cities in the East under the auspices of Colonel Alvarin Allen. Billed as the slayer of Custer, Sitting Bull's words of friendly greeting to his audience were always translated as lurid accounts of the Custer massacre. The following year was to be a happier one for him, though. He joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. While the show toured the States, Sitting Bull was universally booed and cursed, but when the show moved to Canada, he became the star of the show, receiving the most applause from the audience. He came to think much of Buffalo Bill, and as for Annie Oakley, he was so impressed with her marksmanship that he adopted her as his daughter. During his stay with the show, Sitting Bull made a considerable amount of money, but most of this money went into the pockets of the poor children who hung around the show at each city. Sitting Bull resumed his life at Grand River, where he lived in a log cabin, farmed, and raised a few chickens and cattle. He also had a cabin where he looked after the orphans of his camp, and it is to his great credit that these children he reared never spoke anything but good of him. In the autumn of 1888, Sitting Bull went with a delegation of Sioux chiefs to Washington to discuss the sale of 11 million acres of their lands. The government had offered the outrageously low price of 50 cents an acre, but all the Sioux were opposed to it. The following summer, a commission, headed by General Crook, went amongst the Sioux to try and effect the sale of these lands again, this time offering the price of $1.50 an acre. The Sioux at Standing Rock, though, were still under Sitting Bull's influence and would not sell. The commission could make no headway, and McLaughlin had secretly to persuade some of the chiefs to change sides. Next day, Sitting Bull and his followers were purposely kept away, whilst the confused Sioux signed the treaty under the threats of removal to another land. It was a sad day for the Sioux. Even agency chiefs such as John Grass regretted their signing of the treaty afterwards. In 1889, the drums of the Sioux were beating out a new rhythm, the rhythm of the ghost dance, which was part of a new religion that was spreading to all the Indians of the plains. When Kicking Bear, one of the Sioux leaders of the ghost dance, arrived in Sitting Bull's camp in October of 1889, he told that the time was approaching when the whites were to be destroyed by supernatural means, and he instructed Sitting Bull and his followers in their first ghost dance. The dance itself was violent, and dancers would drop exhausted to the ground and fall into a trance. In these dances they were believed to be dead, and when they revived they often told of seeing dead relatives and friends in the spirit world. Sitting Bull danced. He particularly wanted to see a favourite daughter that had died, but he had no vision. McLaughlin tried unsuccessfully to persuade Sitting Bull to stop the dance at his camp. Sitting Bull suggested that the two of them should go and try and find the Messiah. If they did find him, and did not see the nations of the dead returning, then he, Sitting Bull, would tell the Sioux it was all a lie, and this would stop the dance. But if they did find the Messiah, then McLaughlin had to let the dance continue. McLaughlin refused the offer. The government in Washington were worried that this ghost dance might lead to an Indian uprising, particularly amongst the Sioux. Troops were moved into locations around the various Sioux reservations in case of emergencies. The arrival of these troops near the Pine Ridge and Rosebud Reservation resulted in a large body of Sioux fleeing to the Dakota Badlands, where they remained a source of much concern to the whites. In early December, Short Bull, the chief Sioux ghost dancer, sent an invitation to Sitting Bull to come down to meet the Messiah who was about to appear. Sitting Bull counseled with his followers, and it was agreed that he should ask McLaughlin for a pass to go down to Pine Ridge. But rumors had already reached Sitting Bull's camp that the soldiers were coming to take away their guns and horses, and to arrest Sitting Bull and take him away. A nightly guard was set up around the chief's cabin, but one night, after a ghost dance, Sitting Bull had told his guards to go home. Asleep on the floor of his cabin, Sitting Bull was suddenly awakened in the early morning. His cabin was full of Indian police. They held him fast and told him to get dressed, giving him a shirt and dark blue leggings to put on. At pistol point he was pushed outside his cabin, where his followers had gathered. He was pushed through the crowd. Suddenly he stopped, refusing to go any further. Sitting Bull fell, killed instantaneously by a bullet in the back from Lieutenant Bullhead's gun, and a bullet in the back of his neck from Sergeant Red Tomahawk's gun. The fight that followed was soon over, when troops arrived and Sitting Bull's followers fled. After the fighting, one of the relatives of a dead policeman mutilated Sitting Bull's face. The body was later taken to Fort Yates, where it was buried, in quicklime. For many years, Sitting Bull's grave lay untended in the old military cemetery at Fort Yates, until in 1953 the body was moved at the instigation of Grey Eagle, a distant kinsman of the chief, to near Sitting Bull's old home at Grand River. Here a monument was erected to Chief Sitting Bull, America's most famous Indian and the greatest patriot the Sioux ever had.
Hey,